So anyway, let's get into it.
Okay. At the beginning, let's say we introduced each other. I'm gonna introduce again after the recording. My name is Guys, and this is Karina. It's a part of project about science communication and outreach, where we like take very complicated ideas. Let's say try to make it simple and very easy for the public to understand. And so part of the project was to find some medium, and we chose to be an interview with a podcast. The interview, yeah. So the interview would be us interviewing you, and we will interview someone else whose, let's say, views on the theory is not much supportive, and we will discuss the ideas. What, yeah, science. Like you have to say this is what supports it, and this is what stands in its way. So, and and for who supports it, I mean, you were the best option out there, and thankfully you said yes. We are very honored to actually meet you. It's like, yeah, and for the viewers out there, because of course this interview would be recorded and it will be published on YouTube as well. If you give us, of course, you're okay with that. But for now, I mean, everyone knows you, but let's say if you give us a brief introduction about Dr. Dennis McKenna.
Sure. Well, everyone knows me, you say. So one of my claims of fame, maybe the most important one, is I'm Terence McKenna's younger brother. So he was even more notorious. And even though he's been dead for 20 years, he has a bigger fan base than I do. Uh, he's very much
He was
alive on the internet,
he was an
and
icon, and yeah,
indeed, and many of his ideas were timely back in the 90s and are still very timely.
like he's thankfully one of the few people that kept the mushrooms or the psychedelics alive until now. Like,
Absolutely,
yeah,
yeah, by refusing to stop talking about them.
exactly.
you know, and so I'm that, but I'm also, I'm an ethnopharmacologist. I tell people in terms of the brother dyad, Terence sort of went off into philosophy and metaphysics and
Mhm.
became a public figure, almost like a psychedelic pundit, almost. And I chose to stay in the background and focus on science. So I did my PhD at the University of British Columbia in the early 80s, studying ayahuasca, mostly
Mhm.
ayahuasca, and a couple of other hallucinogens. Well, this other one called ukuhe, uh, which was derived from different botanical sources than ayahuasca, but was a similar in the sense that the pharmacology was similar. They were both orally active DMT preparations.
Mhm.
So I did my PhD on ayahuasca, and uh, and then I went on. I did an endless series. It seemed like an endless series of postdocs
Mhm.
after that, because when you graduate with a degree like I did, you're not exactly a hot job prospect. You
Mhm.
have to. My specialty is psychedelics. That
Yeah.
that usually ends the interview right there, or at least it did then. Not so much anymore, but
Oh no.
then that was a deal killer. So I was able to get different postdocs. I was able to pursue my work that way. Initially, I got a fellowship in the Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology at NIMH. So
Mhm.
I moved to Bethesda, Maryland. I spent a couple of years there. Went on to another one at Stanford, studying again. This was my sort of detour into neuroscience. I am
Mhm.
basically a botanist and a plant chemist, but this was all neuroscience, and I was studying the distribution of these 5-HT
Mm.
serotonin receptors in the brain that were involved with psychedelic response. Back in the day, we called them hallucinogens, but
Mhm.
that's really a
Image.
misnomer. So I did that, and I worked for Shaman Pharmaceuticals after that, which was a startup drug discovery company, based on ethnobotanically driven drug discovery. And then I ended up by being disillusioned by that company, and I moved to Minnesota, and I started working for Aveda, which was a cosmetics company. Very interesting cosmetics company started by a visionary who was interested in new ingredients for his products. So he sent me to Brazil to look for new ingredients, and during that time, I played hooky for part of that, and initiated a biomedical study of ayahuasca, which in Brazil, working with the UDV, the Syncretic Church, and that became a pretty important study. It was the first real biomedical investigation of ayahuasca in human subjects. And although it wasn't a clinical trial, it was observational, but we did that in the early 90s, and we got about 8 peer-reviewed papers out of that. There was a big team. This just wasn't all me. And then I ended up teaching at the University of Minnesota courses in ethnopharmacology, plant medicines, and another one in Hawaii every year called Plants and Human Affairs. Did that for a few years, actually quite a few years, from 2002 to 2017. And then for various reasons, my wife and I decided to move back to Canada.
Yeah.
And so here we are. We've immigrated thanks to her. I can be a permanent resident. They can't kick me out. And here we are. And then recently I founded this nonprofit organization called the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. And that's what I've been that's the horse I've been riding. And of course our project, our mission statement has changed radically due to COVID. Originally the plan was to do retreats and conferences in physical places, mostly in South America, which we had been doing before, but COVID shut all that down. So now we're just trying to, present ourselves in a virtual space. And that's why we've been doing these podcasts and virtual seminars and so on, and hoping things are going to open up a little bit.
Yeah, hopefully.
And at some point they will. And then we can begin to do those things. But for now, we're good. We've been doing some things. So that's sort of a summary, probably longer than it should be, but
well, when you achieved so much, it will take some time to just say them.
Yeah, sometimes people say, well, you've achieved so much, and and they make it sound like I knew what I was doing, which in a way isn't really true. I think I was just a curious young man, and I'm a curious old man.
Yeah,
well, that's what leads to achievement.
It's been curiosity.
Yeah, Einstein.
Desire to poke into these kind of obscure places. And of course, psychedelics has been a real, it's a great thing to tie your wagon to, because it's intrinsically interesting. And so I have no regrets. I'm glad to be where I am with all that.
And we are glad that we can meet you as well. Hopefully, maybe in the future we can meet in real life as well.
I would love that. That would be
me
great.
too.
You're based in Belgium, you say?
Yes, in Leuven, Belgium.
I have never been to Belgium, so I have a good...
It's a nice country, and now you have some people there to help you navigate.
Yeah. No, my travels have mostly have been to the south, but I've been to Europe several times, but nothing has brought me to Belgium so far. So
Hopefully we can.
there's always that to do, you know, put it on the bucket list, you know. So.
Hopefully it's soon as well. So let's start by, I don't know, but I think one of the first books you published with your brother, The Invisible Landscape, in which you talked about an experiment, which I think it's what started to launch you both into fame and knowledge, La Chorrera experiment.
Right.
Can you explain? Because I think what happened back then is that you were looking for mostly DMT and ayahuasca, and you stumbled upon the mushrooms, if I'm not mistaken.
We were looking for this other obscure Witoto hallucinogen called ukuhe.
Yes.
And that's what took us to La Chorrera initially, because La Chorrera was the ancestral home of the Witoto people, and they're the ones that had this. Mm-hmm. And then we got to La Chorrera, and there were, you know, mushrooms in abundance, and that kind of reorganized our priorities rather quickly. I'm not going to go into detail on it because we just did this 50th anniversary retrospective on the experiment at La Chorrera.
Yes.
And you can go to the website, you can register for that, even though it's over, you can register and you can see the podcast, you can see everything. And that will give, you know, if we talked about that, we'd be here all day. And I don't want to go into it anymore. I'm done with it.
Yeah, I attended it, but I want just a brief for the viewers, the one who's going to view it, and for my colleague as well, like just what happened, what you benefited from.
Well, like I said in the event, you know, a lot of things happened. And, you know, probably the main thing that happened that had an impact was the fact that we brought the spores back of the mushrooms, and we figured out how to grow those. Turned out to be fairly simple, although it took us 2 years to figure it out, but that's because we didn't know what we were doing. But once we had it down, then we published this little book, and and that had an impact. That had an impact on society because it made mushrooms, you know, available to a lot of people.
Everyone, yes.
And it kind of kept them part of the culture. And now we see the, you know, what that's come to, which has been the, you know, mushrooms are the superstar psychedelic of the psychedelic renaissance. And now they're being looked at for treatment of all sorts of mental problems, and they're not, you know, they're not stigmatized anymore.
No,
I mean, they're in most places they're still more or less illegal, but science is catching up, and so we can see that you know, they have a lot of potential to, I think, revolutionize mental health care, revolutionize psychiatry. And beyond that, to really revolutionize society, because, you know, these compounds work on an individual level, but they also work on a collective level. And sometimes I say psychedelics are medicines for the soul in a certain way. They can be used to certainly help individuals, but to help society and ultimately the planet, ultimately this species, you know.
How do you mean that? What do you mean when you say about collective level, and how do you think that can revolutionize society?
By essentially by organizing or shifting our relationship with nature. You know, I think that's the feeling, that's the main insight that many people come away with when they take ayahuasca or take mushrooms in nature, is the understanding that we're part of nature, and nature, you know, we don't own nature. We're not running this show. Nature is running this show. And, you know, if you don't believe that, you could just look at COVID. I mean, I look at COVID as a strong message from nature of a
Reminder.
different sort, that just like the psychedelics, it's like, wake up, you monkeys, you know,
Mm.
there's a lot going on here that
Yeah.
you don't get. So I think that psychedelics have the potential to shift consciousness on a global scale, to reorient our relationship with nature, because we've disrespected nature for so long, at least in the Western tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I lay a lot of the blame for that to the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, which teaches us that we own nature. Nature exists to serve humanity.
Yes, yeah.
No, it doesn't. You know,
Yeah.
nature is its own thing, and this arrogance that we've had, and this encouragement of the devaluation of nature. It's like, you don't need to worry about nature because your reward is in heaven, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is a shell game, in
True.
my opinion. We need to learn to revalue nature and respect it. That requires that we change a great deal about the way we live, you know,
Yes,
and
true.
that's the hard lesson. But in that sense, Karina, I think that's what I mean when it can heal the collective soul, you know, because just like one of the problems is we are so out of balance, we are so out of sync that sorry, I keep watching my phone. We're so out of sync with nature. And ultimately, that means we're out of sync with ourselves. You know, we're out of touch with ourselves. So the mushrooms can shift that perspective back. You know, the reason there is so much individual mental illness, especially depression and suicidality and trauma and all that, is partly a reflection of our society as a whole. I mean, people are traumatized, but society is traumatized. And this points the direction to healing those wounds. You know, I look for a day when these mushrooms and other psychedelics are not prohibited, and they are available to people who want them. You know, not necessarily in a clinical setting. You know, I would like to see it more like the way it's traditionally done.
In Europe, surprisingly, it exists. There's websites where you can order a growing kit, where you can grow your own type of. And while I was researching for this interview, I stumbled upon this site, and I found this mushroom called McKenna. So is that like for you or?
Oh yeah, McKenna.
McKenna, yes.
That's not a real species, but yes, I know. So you might have ordered that from my friend in Amsterdam.
Yes, it's in Amsterdam. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the name of his company?
Growth Smart or something, or Smart Kit, Smartific, I think, something like that.
Yeah, something. I'm trying to think of the name of his company, but anyway, yeah.
But like now in Europe, it's there. Although the legality here in Europe is weird a little bit. Like you can buy a growing kit, you can buy the spores, you can buy everything. You cannot grow it though. But they will not come to your door and knock on like, are you growing or not? You know, but it's kind of legal but illegal. I don't know how things works with them here, but yeah, it's kind of weird.
Well, it's a similar situation in Canada and the States. Right now, it's kind of in a quasi-legal situation.
Yes, it's in the middle.
Most places it's not legal, but now it's happening by municipalities, and states is where the level on which the law is changing. So different municipalities have decriminalized these mushrooms.
I think there's an American state, Oregon, if I'm not mistaken, that legalized everything.
Oregon and California is about to go that way.
Yeah.
And a number of cities, So this is very encouraging because
finally,
these things should never have been prohibited. I mean, it's just outrageous, the very idea that you could prohibit, any organism, because these organisms are are, you know, symbiotic partners with us.
Yeah.
You know, that's how I look at it. I look at our relationship with these psychedelics. There's various levels you can look at them, but the 30,000 foot level is that these are co-evolutionary partners with our species. You
Yeah.
know,
And how is
they
that? How is it co-inhabitants?
how is it what?
How are we symbiotic? Like, what is our part there?
Well, any organism that we value, that we form an alliance with, that's what symbiosis is a close relation between different species, usually for mutual benefit. Well, the mushrooms want to grow. That's basically what they want to do, right? That's their whole thing, is to grow. So they partner with this primate who enjoys what they have to offer, you know, the experience, and everybody benefits. I mean, there are other kinds of symbioses, like, you know, with food plants, for example, or other types of medicinal plants. These are all a form of symbiosis,
Yeah.
you know. But the interesting thing, among many interesting thing about the alliance with the mushrooms, is that you know, these are teachers in a way.
Yeah.
Or you know, I mean, we have to be careful of projecting onto them, but basically
Yeah.
they're teachers in the sense that we learn from them.
Yeah.
And certainly many of the messages that we get from them seem to come from an intelligence that is not us, you know, and maybe it's a part of us that we only access through that experience, or maybe there really is an intelligence out there that has a message. But whatever it is, it's pretty clear that we have a lot to learn from these mushrooms.
Yeah. I think Paul
And
Statham's called it. Those are our elders. We have to respect them. We have to learn from them.
exactly, and in some ways, and this gets right back to the stoned ape hypothesis. You
Yes.
know, the stoned ape idea, which I don't like. I mean, to call it the stoned ape hypothesis is kind of to diminish it, to mock it in some ways, to dismiss it. And I think it's unfortunate that that's become the current way of talking about it. But that's just, you know, that's just what the media does and so on. But the implication is a little bit simplistic, that, you know, back in the ancient times before we were actually even human, you know, we started eating these mushrooms and suddenly we became smart. You know, it's not quite like that, you know, but it's that I think, and the interesting thing about the stone ape hypothesis, or the idea that early hominids, maybe back as far as 2 million years, actually had a relationship with these mushrooms, and that they, and if we look at the fossil record, which is all we have when we want to go back that far, we know that in North Africa, where, you know, there were probably not just one lineage of Homo sapiens, there were several, more or less modern humans. Most of these lineages died out, but these hominid populations were evolving in this sub North African environment, right? But it wasn't a desert at the time. It was much wetter. It was more tropical, and so and then also in this environment there were cattle. There were cattle-like animals called aurochs, the ancestors of the modern cattle, the cebu, the humpback cebu, white cattle. And there's fossil evidence for this. This is all documented. You know, there's fossil evidence that in this environment, same environment where you find the skeletal remains of various hominids, you also find the skeletal remains, the fossilized remains of these
Animals.
cattle-like organisms. Well, clearly those populations were those cattle were probably an important food source for these populations. They were hunting them basically.
Yeah.
And but if you have these two elements in the ecology, the hominids who are hungry, and hunter-gatherers and very sharp-eyed, very attuned to their environment, and so on. And then there were cattle, which were clearly there. Well, clearly, I mean, there's no fossil evidence for it, but in that ecology, you got cattle and you got cow shit, which they grow on.
They grow on,
You've got hominids. So the mushrooms had to be there, basically. They had to be in this environment. And if you go to any similar ecology in modern times, tropical pastures with cattle, the world over, you will find these mushrooms, and it's probably very similar to what it was back then. So the three elements, the three partners, shall we say, or components of the symbiosis. In this case, there were three partners. There was the mushrooms, the cattle, and the people.
Yes.
And and all were symbiosis, all part of the symbiosis, where close relationships, mutual benefit.
Yes.
In the case of cattle, obviously food and clothing, milk, and all that. And then what the mushrooms bring to the table.
Yeah.
And and this there's no reason to think that 2 million years ago this environment did not exist.
Yeah.
And if it existed, the Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms in particular are they're robust, they're big, they stand out. You can't be in these environments without noticing them, right?
Yes.
Just like when we got to La Chirera, like every cow pie had a big cluster of mushrooms growing out of it. So it's not like they're going to overlook something, particularly if you're a hungry primate, looking for something to eat, right?
Yeah, basically, because no fridges back then, so if you have food, you eat. So
if you have it, you eat. And they don't taste great, but as mushrooms go, they taste pretty good. And probably, who cares? I mean, back then,
it's food.
So they would. So I think that this relationship developed in that ecology, in this symbiotic, three-way symbiotic relationship. And then when Terence's book was published, there were a couple things that had not surfaced yet, that were not really known at that time, but subsequently have become known. One of them is the fact that recent studies have shown that psilocybin and other things like it, but particularly psilocybin, actually stimulate neurogenesis, and they stimulate the formation of new connections in the brain, and they contribute to the complexification of our neural wiring, if you want to put it that way. They actually promote this. And, so neuroplasticity is what we're talking about.
Yes, exactly.
It used to be that they thought once you have a certain complement of neurons, and that's what you have for life, and it's downhill from there. Well, we know now that is not the case, that various things can stimulate neurogenesis. And one of the things that catalyzes that is psilocybin, and presumably other psychedelics. And they can do brain mapping that shows this increase in connectivity and all that. So this is a possible mechanism that would explain why there's this rapid, almost explosive expansion of the human brain over 2 million years, which is a very short span of time, an
Yeah.
evolutionary period. That, it was a very relatively rapid.
And yeah, especially with epigenetics as well. Epigenetics was not known back then.
Epigenetics, and then epigenetics is the other side of this.
Yeah.
Epigenetics provides the mechanism
Yeah.
whereby this, you don't have to invoke natural selection
Yeah.
and transmission of traits through the usual way,
Yeah.
through the gametes. Epigenetics is a mechanism whereby these traits can be inherited without going through that mechanism. And
Yeah.
we now know that, epigenetics is the basis of the it's basically the mechanism that underlies the communication between the environment and the genome, that doesn't involve natural selection or mutation. You don't have to invoke mutation because epigenetics can influence the gene expression
Yes.
of these genes that are already there, but maybe not activated. Well, I think that the mushrooms activate through epigenetics, activate the expression of functions related to cognition and imagination.
Yeah.
This is the thing. I mean, if I wanted to sum it up in one sentence, I would say the mushrooms taught us how to think. They gave us the tools of the imagination.
Yes.
And from that, everything else proceeds. And I go further and I say much of this, I think much of this has to do with synesthesia, which is, synesthesia is the translation of one sensory modality into another, like seeing music, for example, or, that kind of thing. Synesthesia happens all the time in psychedelics. It's one of the few characteristics of the experience that reliably people experience. You can take mushrooms, put your headphones on, and it will, it will definitely modulate and drive the inner visions that you're having. So there's a linkage between vision and sound. And the other component of that is meaning, significance, right?
Yeah.
So what they sometimes call portentousness, mushrooms and other psychedelics can make you, entertain or certain experiences as very portentous, meaning meaningful, essentially. Or whether they're meaningful or not, they make you think they're meaningful.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing behind the mechanism. So it provided this this critical relationship between sound and which can be vocalization, or it can be music. It can be produced by instruments or the human voice, singing, vocalization, all of those things, and vision. And those two things alone, if they are linked to symbolic apprehension, then you have it. You have the basis of language. I mean, that's what language is a way of projecting out into the world these meaningful perceptions, which may be audio or visual or both, but and if you think about language is synesthesia. We don't think of it that way, but because we do it without
thinking,
without a second thought, it's just so much ingrained into us. But if you think about it, I'm sitting here, I'm babbling, I'm making meaningless sounds, right? Small mouth noises, my brother liked to call them. but actually these sounds have a meaning because you
Yes.
can understand what I'm saying.
Mm.
If I say chair, chances are you visualize a chair in your
Yeah.
head. If I say star, you visualize it, a star. And so you've got this critical sort of cognitive space that involves visual input, audio input, and then that all important meaningful content. And that kind of defines consciousness, doesn't it? In some ways, this is the space that we inhabit. And we know that evolutionarily also, a great deal of the brain, large parts of the brain, evolved to over this 2 million year period, evolved to be able to sorry, lost my train of thought, but there's a lot of neural architecture devoted to language, both the generation of language and the comprehension of language. Those structures don't exist in primates. These are human structures, hominid structures, and they that's one of the elements of the hominid brain that sets it apart from the ape brain or the monkey brain or so on. We have certain genes related to the expression of language and so on that are not found in other primate species. And so the stage was set, early on, possibly as long as 2 million years ago. And, the other thing about the mushrooms that is in some ways unique is that they don't require any technology, right? There's no preparation involved. I mean, if you look a lot of these traditional psychedelics like ayahuasca, that's a very sophisticated preparation. That's not something that you're going to come up with spontaneously. It requires a knowledge. For one thing, you have to know how to cook, and this, the relationship for the mushrooms may have predated the controlled use of fire. The controlled use of fire was probably somewhere between 1 and 1.2 million years ago. But the relationship with the mushrooms could have been much older than that. So these other psychedelics did not really come on scene until technology has advanced to the point where people were routinely cooking up. I mean, the invention of fire and the ability to make teas, essentially, was that amounts to the invention of pharmacology and chemistry. If you can't mix up stuff, you can't get very far with chemistry. Mushrooms don't require any of that. They are ready to eat. All you have to do is be curious enough to bend over, pick them up, and
try
munch on them.
Yeah.
So it's like, they are there for the picking, literally.
What like makes that theory more compelling, let's say, it's the fact that 23, I think, like almost like a lot of animals have been observed in nature to actually get high, basically.
Yes.
In the use, whether it's mushroom or even the plant for DMT, like the plant for ayahuasca. Like I think even there's a video, which I think you saw it at Joe Rogan, which was amazing. Like tiger, I think, like
Yeah, I've
started.
seen that video. I'm not sure I buy it, but your point is taken that
Yeah.
animals do take
Yeah, like 23
mushrooms.
primates,
Yeah,
including humans,
primates
actually use it.
and even elephants and things
Yeah.
like that. So mammals like altered state. I
Yeah.
mean, we take these things because we enjoy what they do to
Yeah.
us. I mean, sometimes they're terrifying, but usually not. Usually they are, they're pleasant experiences, and
Yeah.
we, this is part of the, the symbiosis. I mean, we value biologically active plants. Some of them relieve pain. Some of them help us sleep. Some of us stimulate us, but some of them give visions. And
Yeah.
those are the interesting ones. So
Yeah.
they're all interesting, but
Even
I think that's part of the spectrum of the relationship we have with
it seems
these.
animals like to get high because dolphins as well has been observed to with pufferfish because their poison gets them high. Do not kill them. So, and
Right.
they even
It's
presented like a behavior like a human behavior with the joint, like a dolphin goes in like on the pufferfish and then like to the other dolphin and so forth, like the joint, like what you do with the joint in the human behavior, which is
Right,
interesting.
right.
Like it seems that almost every animal with a neurological system, let's say, like a primate, like a dolphin, like has this need or want, I don't know what you call it, to get high using valuable tools, which can
Yeah,
explain
I think
and
that's right. I mean,
yeah,
because we have these complex nervous systems, I mean, I don't know if you get this in non-mammalian species, although possibly you do. But birds, for instance, may. But certainly, there's plenty of evidence from from animals that it's not uncommon to consume these substances. Now, a question becomes, well, so how come, well, dolphins may be an exception because dolphins are probably as intelligent as we are,
yeah, that's
but they do not have hands. So
no,
that's a limitation for them, or maybe not. Maybe they don't, maybe they can just live in a pure mental state of bliss or whatever, and they're not out there ruining the world with their opposable thumbs and all that. They're just content to live in an entirely mental kind of sphere. And yeah.
And is there any research going on apes taking psychedelic mushrooms and how that may affect their cognitive abilities or synesthesia, if it exists in primates? Because I don't know if there is research on that.
On what, psychedelic mushrooms and animals?
And primates.
I mean, it's an obvious question, and it's a good question, and I don't really know the answers. I think that there must be some investigation of giving primates psychedelic mushrooms, but I'm not aware of that. And that's a very good question, and I'm surprised that there isn't more on it. Again, I think if you start giving mushrooms to, chimpanzees, for example, or bonobos or whatever, I mean, I kind of doubt that they're going to, suddenly start writing and
probably not the
vocalizing
next
magic,
day.
But give them a few million years and they might end up.
yeah. Do you think now, after decades of you and late turns getting with the theory, do you think now with new knowledge about what does psychedelics do to the brain, let's say, in the neurogenesis and epigenetics, do you think now the theory has more power now, or do you think it's less?
Yes, absolutely. This is what I say in the foreword to the book, is that, because of these discoveries, when Terence wrote the book, a lot of people dismissed it. Most people dismissed it. And, he's just some crazy druggie, who's trying to come out with this idea. Some of the more thoughtful people said, plausible, plausible. But now it's gone from, because of these discoveries about neurogenesis and epigenetics and all that, and neuroplasticity, it's gone from plausible to probable.
Probable, yes.
I think it's more plausible than not I mean, I think the burden of proof for the skeptics is, in a way, if you frame it in the context that, yeah, this environment did exist, the primates were there, the cattle were there, the mushrooms were there, how can it not be true? Or what are you going to say? How are you going to defend the notion that evolving in this environment, the primates never did, they never did,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They never tried it. So I
Yeah.
think the theory is stronger now than ever.
Yeah. Another question. What do you think is an evidence, like a very clear evidence that can support the theory in a way, like, okay, like even the mainstream science community starts say, okay, it's actually very, very probable, like it's one of the most like compelling evidence. Like, what do you think is an evidence that can persuade the mainstream scientists into
This
thinking
is very tricky,
Yeah.
this getting physical evidence, it's the same challenge that that Brian Morar-Eskew, who wrote this book, the immortality key, it's the same challenge that he's facing. Where's the actual physical chemical evidence? So in his case, he's looking at the residues of these different vessels that contain chemical markers that are evidence that they were used for fermentation. I mean, when you ferment beer from grains, you get certain acids are formed that are like markers for fermentation. And then in a couple of these vessels, he actually found evidence of ergot. So that's huge. Brian and I talked yesterday when we did our interview about the evidence for mushrooms and is there evidence for mushrooms? The problem is mushrooms don't last very well. 2 million years is a hell of a long time for some organic, thing like that to last. The reason there's evidence of ergot is that ergot forms these sclerotia. Ergot forms these very hard structures that are resting structures that conceivably could last a long, long time. Mushrooms, the only analogous structure there is spores. And you could potentially look at some of these excavations. You could even look for spores of Psilocybe cubensis. There are ways to identify those and so on. But even then, it wouldn't even prove anything, because if the mushrooms were around, the spores were around. So they're going to show up all sorts of places. But I think you could, if you could excavate some of these middens in some of these caves, you could look for spores, evidence of spores. Absent a time machine, it's going to be hard to definitely prove this.
Yeah, true.
But suppose we find spores and we have the evidence that those mushrooms were there and our ancestors had the opportunity to take them. And do you think that
if you could show the spores were there, that would really bolster the argument?
Well,
it wouldn't prove it.
Yeah, it wouldn't prove it. It would make it stronger. But do you think that synesthesia can prove the argument? Because I'm not sure if I'm understanding it correctly, but I've always thought that synesthesia is something that some people have and some people don't. But now when you say that speech, language is also synesthesia, it confuses me. Right. Yeah, but let's say, do we have any research that studies whether people who do not report synesthesia in normal life start reporting it not during the psilocybin taking the mushroom, but after it? Is it a long
for many people, that's the only time they experience synesthesia.
But they don't experience it after that.
I can't say. Maybe they do. Maybe this is a learned skill. we know that some people are, as you say, they're genetically synesthetic. For some people, this is just built into the way that they apprehend the world. And it's very interesting, you know, how synesthesia is often related to things like numbers and letters and that sort of thing. And people will say, well, you know, the letter B is, you know, hard and polka dot, you know, or you know, and it's very interesting how synesthesia is often related to these things like numbers and letters, which are really abstractions, but to the people that experience them, they are real things, you know, like almost like imagined objects. So I think that's interesting.
Well, I can relate to that, and I think that's really interesting when you say that it's related to numbers and letters and how that's related to speech. And do you think, or maybe do you know about research of that same thing in, again, primates? Do you think that synesthesia can be observed or in some way proved that it exists in primates?
There's probably some way to do it. Some very clever person might figure it out, but I'm not sure how you would approach that.
Another, like, let's say, I was reading a book. It's called How to Change Your Mind. It
Yes,
talks
Michael
about
Pollan's book.
yes, talks about LSD, talks about psychedelics in general with DMT as well, and he listed a lot of experiments that were done in the 50s and 60s with amazing results, with PTSD, or they called it back then shell shock, with people who got terminal illness, like the changes, even with normal people who just wanted to try it, the changes, the changes reported, the trips, although some trips were bad, let's say, but most of the trips, because, you know, it was a lab control trip, so they usually have someone there to comfort them, to tell them everything's gonna be fine, which makes it good. But what kind of shocked me when I read that book is like all these amazing discoveries, and then the government comes and says, nope, this is illegal now. And what shocks is not the government. The government is always dumb in that way. But what shocked me is the scientific, or the science community response to it, which was complete, just, okay, it's wrong, don't do it. And as you said, in 70s, 80s, if psychedelics were mentioned, it's like a death, like, I don't know.
Well, I guess this is an example of you know, the influence of politics and policy on science, right? I mean, you know, the research on psychedelics in humans was shut down, you know, not for any scientific reason or any very sound reason. I mean, the decisions to do that were not made by scientists or medical experts or anything like that. They were made by politicians, who are by and large idiots.
Exactly.
You know, and it was made out of it from a place of hysteria. It was like, I mean, basically what it came down to was, oh my God, our kids are taking these strange substances and having a lot of ideas that we don't think are good, you know. I mean, the danger of dangerous ideas, of, you know, and that's the basis on which they were made illegal, and it's taken 40 years to overcome that. And now science is, you know, circling back on it and say, well, there's, you know, I mean, what's done that is that there's been a lot of good science done, but it took 40 years to even open the door. Well, not quite that long. The psychedelics were basically prohibited around 1970. And the door began to be forced open a lot by Rick Strassman's work on DMT, which took place in the early 90s. So 20 years before the FDA was comfortable enough to say, yes, you can, you know, you can conduct this study. So, and it's a pity because now that we're seeing their potential for treating mental health problems, we could, we lost 20 years. The mental health psychiatric community could be that much further ahead if that had never happened, and because it was, a lot of people have suffered who didn't need to, and it's taken this long to really get to the point where we can, again begin to take a closer look at it, because there's been an accumulation of great science in that period, and the FDA, whatever flaws it may have, and it has many, but at least in the States, the FDA bases their evaluations pretty much on science. I mean, there's always political influences, but they try to base that on science. So now mushrooms and other psychedelics they've gone from being, these horrible, scary drugs that are going to drive you insane and destroy your chromosomes and all that stupid stuff, to now they're being hailed as the great hope for psychotherapy, which they are.
A lot of I noticed that there is a lot of research, like especially the 50s and the 60s, where actually most of the people were psychologists. Like it wasn't medicinal; it was psychologists who did it and saw or noticed a lot of improvements in the subjects. So it's certainly now, finally, we're opening our eyes to possibilities of the psychedelics, and hopefully the government actually this time just stand out of the way of the innovation. They always somehow stop it.
Yeah, I think we were not, as a society, I think we weren't ready to accept psychedelics into society. But now enough has changed that, and because there's good science about it, and because there's, good reports. I mean, back in the day, there was nothing good said about psychedelics in mainstream media. Now there's all kinds of things. So I think we've matured in a certain sense. And, we realize they're not going to destroy society. At least maybe they should destroy the society that we live in, but they're not a threat to civilization. They may be the solution to, evolving into a civilization that's more humanized, more compassionate, more attuned to nature and the realities of our dependence on nature and our interconnectedness with the rest of nature. Because I do think they are cognitive, they're catalysts for coming to these realizations.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of reports now, because now it's opened a lot of people who are doing microdosing, whether it's LSD or mushrooms. So what do you think are the main benefits, and do you advise the people on trying it, like trying microdosing or trying the complete trip, or both?
Well, I'm kind of a skeptic about microdosing. I've often said that I'm not sure microdosing is much more than a placebo effect. And now there are actually a couple of studies that's come out that support that view. You may have heard of them. There's been a very recent study that was published that showed that it was a interesting study design. It was an online study. It was, but there was a placebo control and an active control. And long story short, both groups showed improvements. The placebo and the psychedelic group showed improvements in the parameters that were measured. And I am not surprised. I have tried microdosing with both LSD and mushrooms at various times. I haven't been very impressed in my own experience, but maybe I'm not doing it right. But
Yeah, there's a lot of people saying,
I
yeah, do this, do that, whatever. Like, there's no
well, I
consensus.
think in some ways microdosing may be something that people who are afraid to actually take a
Yeah,
psychedelic want to do so that they can be with the cool kids. You
yeah,
know, I mean, but I think they need to remember that just around the corner, just a few grams up
yeah,
in dose, there is a world of wonder,
yeah,
and they should, before they make a judgment, they should get their courage and explore that world. You know, that's what psychedelics are
hmm,
for. And microdosing, maybe not, but I don't see the strong evidence. And believe me, I'm not. I mean, I wish that it was so. And there's a lot of companies that are, these startups that are basing their whole thing on microdosing.
yeah.
And I think this may not be a good model for a good business model, because I'm just not convinced that they,
Hmm. Have
that
any benefits or have any measured benefits, let's say.
yeah, possibly. I mean, they might be useful. Where they might be more useful is after you've had a profound psychedelic experience and
Hmm.
learned what there is to learn and integrated that. It may be that microdosing could be used to reaffirm that, to
Hmm.
kind of reintegrate that or return to that, so that the beneficial effects, which tend to be long lasting anyway,
Yeah.
particularly with psilocybin, so that you reinforce the insights that you got from the original high dose trip.
Hmm.
But I think anyone that thinks they can understand what psychedelics are really about without taking a higher dose is kidding themselves.
Yeah.
You're not going to get there with microdosing. You're just not going to
Yeah, I
get there.
think reading about it too, they mentioned something called the breakthrough, which is like an experience. Usually, the DMT and psilocybin, who try them, like go through, like, and it doesn't happen from the first try. Like they have to try it like once, twice, three times, until they get to it. I think most of them even call it the ego death, which
Mm-hmm.
basically you become one with nature. Like that's how they describe it. Like
Right.
you no longer see yourself as a different part of the nature. uh, and yes, I think, like, according to what I read so far, at least, because I haven't tried it, but according to what I read so far, is that it's a profound experience that if most of the people actually jump into it, I'm not going to say jump because that may sound like an educated thing, but like understand the thing and try it, it could actually benefit humanity. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
because when you see all the troubles in the world and the last, like, politics with the corona, you realize how much ego, or the human ego, is part of the problem. How it's not
Yeah.
only part, it's the essential part of the problem.
Right. Right.
And
Exactly. And
yeah,
and that's what psychedelics can do. They can dissolve the ego temporarily, and that is a good thing.
yes, and it shows
That's
you that
definitely a good thing,
uh,
because that's their main virtue, is they let you step out of your reference frame temporarily, step out of your own egoic structure and all these things that you construct around that, this so-called default mode network and so on. The fact
yeah,
that the psychedelics can disable this temporarily is primary to their therapeutic benefits, because they give you an opportunity to look at that from arm's length.
yeah,
This set of habits and assumptions and behaviors that you develop, and understand it better and change it. Actually re-engineer how the default mode networks. I often compare this to rebooting your computer.
yeah.
I think there's a lot to that analogy, because I
Mhm.
think by flooding your neural system with the serotonin agonist, you literally reset the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
And just like your computer, after you restart, often works better. You get a lot of the kludge from it, and it works
Yes,
better for a
the
while.
memory is like cleans everything clean. Another question. I remember one time. Sadly, I could not find the full interview, but it was with some channel. And you said when they asked you about the stoned ape hypothesis, or theory, you said that you think of it as a software, and you reminded me with that analogy, like it's a software, like it resets how the brain works in those early humanoid, let's say, and that could be the potential in what led in the future to more consumption of it, probably epigenetic, as we just discussed, and maybe not. We do not know. Hopefully, we get an answer. Maybe not, but it's a beautiful theory to think about, honestly, and to.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's kind of too, like, if you look at it, it's humbling too to the humans who thinks, oh no, I'm not. Oh yeah, you are against psychedelics, but you are originally from a stoned hippie ape. like, like you see, like it's very interesting to think about.
Yeah. Well, I think that when these hominids originally stumbled on the mushrooms and started consuming them 2 billion years ago or whatever, it had to be a profoundly impactful experience. And the interesting thing is, here we are, 2 billion years later, it's still profoundly
Yes,
impactful,
I mean,
and it's as amazing to us as it must have been to them.
I think even more to them, because now we know what it does, and we know this is gonna give you profound visuals, and you expect them. But imagine you eating just food, and these visuals just come to life.
Right.
Yeah. So
Well, yeah, that would have been a surprise for sure.
yeah, at least, to say the least. What is your most profound experience?
The cartoon I sometimes show, the couple is at the table having dinner, and the waiter is there taking the order, and the guy says, what is the alternate reality salad? And the waiter says, oh, mushrooms from the chef's own garden.
Yeah, it definitely is gonna be an alternate reality.
Yeah.
So I have a question. What is the most profound experience you had under psychedelics, if I must say?
Oh, I don't know. It's hard to pick out one that, rises to the top of everything. I can't. That's not really a fair question. I've taken too many psychedelics. I've had lots of profound experiences. One of the ones maybe that was impactful for me was my experience of photosynthesis on ayahuasca, which I've written about. I had a biochemist's tour through the process of photosynthesis in one of my ayahuasca visions. And that was really profound for me, because it made me appreciate how important photosynthesis is to maintaining life on Earth. And if you've read my book, I include that in there at some point. Have you read it by any chance?
Not
Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss.
Oh no, I am looking for it. The thing is, I do not know. Like, I don't have the ability to. I just cannot read from a laptop or a phone. I have to get the physical copy. I searched for it here when I came. I found a Dutch copy, but I don't speak Dutch yet. I'm learning. Yeah. But yeah, I'm looking for an English copy for the Brotherhood of the Abyss. And
it's it's out of print.
Oh.
The physical copies are out of print. There are some people selling them off Amazon. Not me, because I'm not charging that, but they're often like hundreds of dollars. But what there is the Kindle version.
Ah,
which I am happy to send to you if you if unless you don't like to read Kindles, but I can just attach that to an email and you can, you know,
well, if I cannot find a physical copy, then I have to.
yeah,
Like,
you.
yeah.
I'm trying to find someone that can help me reprint this for print on demand, and so far I've not had very good luck. There were
It,
some
it's an
technical.
interesting book because you discuss in that book a lot of the what happened with you and your brother from your own point of view, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah,
and the processes. Uh, like, if I may ask a question, like, what was the experience that you and your brother had that made you come up with the stoned ape hypothesis?
with the stoned ape
Yeah.
hypothesis. Well, the genesis of the stoned ape hypothesis really it didn't come directly from La Chirera or all those experiences. I mean, basically, the stoned ape hypothesis is more my idea than my brother's idea,
Uh-huh.
uh, in the sense, although everybody gives him the credit, but in fact, uh, uh,
Yeah, it's the
you
credit
know,
is, yeah.
yeah, I mean, he was the older brother and so on. And he didn't really have the biochemical background
Yeah.
to explain it. I mean, not that I want to take away from his book, which is, on rereading it like 30 years later, it stands up pretty well. But the Stone Ape hypothesis came over a few decades of thinking about this,
Hmm.
and these primates and other organisms evolving in these chemically complex ecologies, because if you look at plant chemistry,
Mm.
all of these so-called secondary compounds that plants make, and you probably heard my rap about this on different YouTube
Yeah.
channels and so on, all these secondary compounds that plants make are what plants use to mediate their communication with everything in the environment. Plants don't have behavior in the way that animals do. They can't run away from threats. They're stuck
Yeah,
in
true.
one place. So they respond through chemistry. And
Hmm.
effectively, chemistry is the language of plants. And these things are messenger molecules, and they communicate with everything in their environment through these molecular mechanisms, from bacteria and fungi in the soil that they may form relationships or symbiosis with, or sometimes they just want to be protected from, to uh, to other things that may want to
Yeah.
eat the plant, may want to nibble on the plant,
Hmm.
and some of those things are just repellents or toxins,
Yeah.
but others are more symbiotic initiators,
Hmm.
like the psychedelics. They're secondary compounds that plants make.
Yeah.
People consume them and they like the effect. So the
Yeah.
message of those kinds of molecules is, not go away, don't bother me, you'll be
Yeah.
sorry if you consume me. The message is come closer,
Yeah.
eat me, and you'll be delighted. And then you
Yeah.
form the symbiosis,
Because when you pick it up, you like the spores goes, so it's like
Yeah.
an
Well,
evolution.
the spores go everywhere, and
Yeah.
we adopt this
Yeah.
plant, this mushroom, we cultivate it all
Yes,
over the
exactly.
place,
Yeah.
and we fulfill its mission,
Hmm.
which is to spread. I mean, that's what they like to do. Terence uh, once said, we're in a symbiotic relationship with something that is disguised itself as an alien invasion so as not to alarm us, right?
Yes.
And there's a bit of that going on.
Yes, I think he's like you both or him mainly spoke about in the Invincible Landscape. You talked about something called time wave zero.
Uh-huh.
I did not understand it, if I may say. Like, this is outside of the interview. I'm genuinely like interested because I could not understand it.
Well, I'll tell you something. I don't understand it either.
Okay, it's safe to assume.
that was Terence's contribution, and you know, and the seeds of the idea for the invisible landscape were definitely planted at La Chorrera.
Yeah.
But he elaborated this idea over many decades, and it's a very interesting idea, which I think is, as a mathematical construct, an interesting way to look at the I Ching. It's quite interesting. It does not describe the structure of time. You know, it just doesn't. And you know, one of the places where Terence and I was always a skeptic about the time wave, or at least his view of it. I was willing to grant that it was probably a functional calendar based on the I Ching. You can make it work that way. But as far as being something that describes the structure of time, it doesn't. And, you know, we used to argue, or maybe have lively discussions is a kinder way to put it. But I told him the problem with the time wave is two things. You cannot state what will disprove it, you know, so it is not a real theory. A real theory must explain what will invalidate it. That's the way science works, right? You construct hypotheses, and then you try like hell to break them down. You try to invalidate them. He never went through that, you know. The other thing is that interpretation of the time wave is pretty much only Terence was able to fully interpret the time wave. So it was a very personal kind of
experience.
thing. It was a reflection of his perspective on time and history and all of that. Not uninteresting, you know, in fact, quite interesting if you read it from that point of view. But as far as being a theory about the structure of time, it just doesn't hold water, you know, and it failed its main, you know, the main criterion that he set up was December 21st, 2012 will either be the manifestation of the singularity, and that will prove it, or it won't. Well, as it turns out, he didn't live long enough to see that. But the outcome is that December 21st, 2012 was probably the biggest non-event in history. I mean, the you know, the Mayan calendar and all that, and the astronomical configurations, all of that happened, but we could have predicted that 1,000 years ago, you know, that these would take place. But any shift in the ontological matrix, if you will, or the, you know, that didn't happen. Or if it happened, it's so subtle, you know, that nobody noticed. I mean, in some ways, I've wondered if maybe, you know, if you step back from the details of the time wave and the nuts and bolts of the time wave and all that, you know, which I think are probably invalid, but Terence's speculation that things are going to get stranger and stranger and stranger as the singularity approaches, here we are, right? I mean, things are about as weird as they've been for a long time. So on that level, maybe there is something to it.